Hey everyone, this is Erica Lucas, your host and founding member of VEST, an organization connecting women across industries, regions, and career levels so that together we can expedite the pipeline of more women in positions of power and influence. Welcome to another episode of the Vestor podcast, where we explore the invisible barriers holding women back in the workplace and share stories of women building power collectively.
For women in politics specifically, I'm worried we're not keeping our eye as well as our efforts and investment on the ball when it comes to recruitment and support for women candidates. Often what happens is you have a great year for women. So in 2018, it was a great year for Democrats. In 2020, it was a pretty darn good year for Republican women, relatively speaking. And I think then folks, party leaders, donors, et cetera, go like, okay, we did it. In the project that we did, this Rethinking Power project, when we were talking to a lot of women office holders and even those working in these fields, when they get into office, especially younger and more progressive women, or on the Republican side, arguably more moderate women, their base is not sticking with them once they're in. And so the ability to stay is a real problem. They go into an institution where they can't make the kind of quick change that their constituencies want, and then they're called traitors or sellouts or whatever. And I think that's a real problem because we're going to lose women. You can't just elect a woman and then be like, great, she's in. Like, folks have to be supportive when the party leadership pushes against them, when other voters come out to attack them. Sticking with those women is not only voting, it's like getting other people in that, explaining to other people why they're doing what they're doing. We can give money. Some of us don't love that that's the way the political system works, but money matters. It's not only because it matters for the campaign, it's also an indicator of support. So we have power to do those things, whatever is most comfortable for you, but like there are ways to get involved that go beyond the vote.
In this episode, VEST member Tara Branson Thomas, Senior Policy Advisor at Claus Law and former Secretary of the Nation for the Muskogee Creek Nation, talks to Kelly Detmart, Associate Professor of Political Science at Rutgers University and Director of Research at the Center for American Women in Politics at Eagleton Institute of Politics. Kelly is a published author in the field of gender and politics, and she's also an influential expert in the field, contributing to publications like Forbes Women and serving as commentator for various media outlets. For our guests' full bios and show notes, go to www.vesther.co/podcast. If you enjoy the episode, share it with a friend and don't forget to leave us a review. This episode is brought to you by Vestor Ventures, a peer network of professional women and investment fund for women-led companies in the care economy and future of work. To learn more, go to www.vesther.co. This episode was part of a more intimate coaching session with VEST members and has been repurposed to accommodate this episode.
I think I'll just start off and ask you kind of what you're excited about in this season. I know it's a presidential year, but just wondering what you're excited about and then what you're worried about. I think we all have some concerns. There's a lot of initiatives out in the world, and everyone's thinking about those as they go to the ballot box. So it'd be great to hear from you and get your perspective.
Great. Thanks, Tara. Thanks for doing this. Thank you, Erica and the team, for organizing it and having me back so I didn't mess up too bad last time. And I also am just really grateful for the work that VEST is doing. I mean, this is part of, I'm going to talk about, I'm sure, throughout the conversation, the most recent project we did at the Center for American Women in Politics, which is called Rethinking Women's Political Power. Erica spoke to me, former Senator Griffin spoke to us for that. And really, that project was looking at how we need to build political power, not just in office holders, but in all of these spaces. And that I know is so important to the work that you all are doing and will lead to that increase of power. So thank you. And let me talk. So I don't think you want to know all my worries because they are too numerous, but I'm going to just talk to a few things about excited, a few things about worried, and keep the conversation going, but happy to elaborate on anything. In terms of what I'm excited about in terms of the election, this is both excited and worried that the stakes are really high. right? And so when the stakes are really high, women already play a major role in determining outcomes in elections, but it will matter even more, right? And so the stakes for women, the role that women can have in this election is huge. As you probably already know, women outnumber and outvote men. They've been doing so for over 40 years. Women, of course, are not monolithic in their voting or in their policy priorities or positions, but they are more likely across the board to at least consider and raise issues around gender equality, even if they have very different positions on how to resolve them. They are also more likely, or we've seen at least recently, that women are more likely to be mobilized by particular threats on issues around gender or gender equality, like those fell after the 2016 election. And again, with the fall of Roe versus Wade, as well as issues like gun violence and environmental degradation, all things, unfortunately, that we are really dealing with in an acute way. So when we talk about the role of women in this election, there is also an urgency that I think we're seeing among a lot of women about their participation. And the last thing in terms of exciting and related to that, I would say young women, especially young women of color, have been at the forefront. Especially in recent years. I have a colleague named Melissa Deckman who's doing some really important work here on Gen Z and mobilization and advocacy, and really pointing to the gender difference, where young women, and again, at that intersection of race and gender, are highly mobilized. Now, the important part is getting them to vote, because there's mobilization in these other spaces, but there's also a disillusionment with formal institutions. But I think there's so much potential there. And again, I hope that leads to my worry. I'm worried that not enough young people, including those most engaged, will choose to vote. Disillusioned by the major party presidential nominees, what's being offered. But again, I don't think that's a lack of interest or engagement. In fact, in some cases, it's the opposite, right? It's that we're highly engaged and see these other opportunities for influence, which are also important. Again, not only an issue with young people, also true across parties and gender, folks who are just turned off by the negativity and toxicity of politics that they see. For women in politics specifically, I'm worried we're not keeping our eye as well as our efforts and investment on the ball when it comes to recruitment and support for women candidates. I think often what happens is you have a great year for women. So in 2018, it was a great year for Democrats. In 2020, it was a pretty darn good year for Republican women, relatively speaking. And I think then folks, party leaders, donors, et cetera, go like, okay, we did it. And so I think we're seeing that. So this year already, and I can talk more about the numbers, we're not seeing record levels of women running writ large. We're not seeing record levels of nominations, and probably won't see huge gains for women across the board. So I will stop there. But those are some of the worries, but also the prospects for potential, influence and success.
That's a really great point. I think as I was reflecting on the Oklahoma primaries, and I live in a rural county in Oklahoma, and there just weren't a lot of female options, whether, no matter what your party was, there wasn't a lot of folks on the ballot to really consider. And so it's interesting, when you talk about we might be in a lull, right, where there's support kind of broadly from political parties. Can you talk a little bit about your research year over year and tell us about the trend maybe going into 2024? And if you make any predictions, I know not everyone does predictions, but if you're thinking, broad, if there are anything we should expect to see or where we still have an opportunity to influence the outcome.
Sure. Yeah, I'll talk about the numbers first. So for those who might not be familiar, the Center for American Women in Politics, one of the things we kind of pride ourselves in and are known for are keeping track of data of women office holders as well as women candidates. So our website, which I'll share the link before we get off, has access to this and data sets that you can look at over time to get to these trends and also just to know where things stand. So I'll give you the short overview. So right now, women are 28.2% of members of Congress, 31.9% of statewide elected executives, governors, attorneys general, et cetera. 32.9%, just less than a third, of state legislators nationwide. And and then 34% of mayors of the top 100 largest cities, about 25.8 when you expand it to cities over 30,000 in terms of mayors. For Congress, statewide, and state legislative levels, those are all record highs. So this is one of those like moments where you go like, we're at records, but we're far below 50%, obviously. Those trends have been up. They were the biggest jumps, again, as I mentioned, were after 2018 for Democratic women and after 2020 for Republican women, pretty consistently across levels in terms of those trends. And then in 2022, we had a relatively stasis year. Again, some increases, but not significant. And I would expect we're going to see that again this year. For those interested, obviously, state by state, happy to talk a little bit more about Oklahoma or Texas. I mean, I think in Oklahoma, just to say, still 45th in the nation in terms of women's representation in the state legislature, 107 in the congressional delegation. Doesn't look like that's going to change per the elections yesterday. And then about 27% of the statewide offices. One trend that is different in Oklahoma than in Texas and or many states across the country is that the representation of women is dominantly Republican. Across the country, the trend is that Democrats far outnumber Republicans among women office holders. Took a lot of reasons why that is. Certainly, some of those are active efforts by those within the party structure. Whether it be electorally incentivized, which I think is a big part of it in the Democratic side of the aisle, or values-based efforts to try to increase women's representation. But when we think about that, and even in the case, I'm going to use Oklahoma as an example. I just think it's a good case. We also have to be cognizant of the trends in terms of women as a percentage of their party. And in that case, even in Oklahoma, women are 11% of their party's office holders in the state legislative level on the Republican side. They are 53% of Democratic office holders. So we have to look at the data in ways to kind of think about power and influence within partisan caucuses, especially in supermajority states. So again, that is true. Unfortunately, in terms of Republican women's power and influence and representation, that's pretty true across the country. We see very few states where Republican women have a high percentage of representation. We've also seen growth in the racial and ethnic diversity of women office holders, again, especially since 2018. You can find all those breakdowns on our website. We have a page specifically dedicated to looking at women by race and ethnicity. But there's a lot of work to do there. So again, I'll just hit a few points. So in the U.S. House, we saw an increase in that level of racial and ethnic diversity, but we still just have one Black woman, one Latina, and two Asian women that serve among 25 women in the Senate. When we look at statewide offices, that's where the starkest racial and ethnic disparities are for women. Just 4 Asian American women, 11 Black, and 8 Latina, 0 MENA, 1 Native woman across the whole country serve in statewide elective executive offices. That's about 23 of 99 women serving. And then again, I'm going to use Oklahoma as an example, just because what we have on our website is you can compare the percentage of women in the population by race and ethnicity and gender to where it stands in the state. So you look at Oklahoma, Native women are about 7.2% of the population, 2% of state legislators. Latinas are 5.8% of the population, 1.3% of members. Black women are 4.8%, right? We could go down the list and it's 1% or 0.7%. So those disparities in representation at those intersections do persist. And I think that's something to pay closer attention to. I'm going to pause there because I have more to say about 24, but I want to give you the chance, Tara, to stop me from talking too much.
No, I definitely appreciate the commentary about our representation, in the general population versus maybe in the areas where decisions are being made about us. And I wanted to talk a little bit or ask you about how that might be impacting our experience with politics, whether that be, from the outside, just being engaged or finding someone who might share a narrative with us, right? And then if that creates a barrier to entry for folks who might be interested in the long term, maybe running for office or serving in some kind of public, if you have done any research or have any notes around how those impact, where we get started, basically.
Absolutely. I think this gets to, we throw around a phrase, and I'm sure in this crew too, like representation matters. But we don't always explain like why and how. And I think when we don't explain, we leave it open to the type of attacks, Erica, you alluded to at the start of this conversation, the kind of anti-DEI. The anti-DEI and the anti-representation kind of like attacks are, you're just checking a box, right? Like you're just doing this because you think X number of women need to be in these positions, but we are choosing on merit. And so the undermining, I think, of efforts to increase representation along axes of demographic identities like gender, like race, like sexual orientation, can be dismissed if we don't fully explain what we mean by why representation matters. And I think for me, you mentioned one of them, right? So representation matters, I would argue, for simple fairness. It's supposed to be a representative democracy, and it's not.
Yeah.
I will say people aren't sold by that argument, but like we should use it. It's absolutely true. But then there are symbolic and substantive reasons why it matters. Symbolically, it matters, and I would say it's both symbolic and substantively for the reason you mentioned, Tara. We know from research that if you see an institution in which your group, whatever that may be, again, it may be at various intersections of race and ethnicity, of age and gender, if you don't see people like you in that position, you are less likely to consider that you can do it or you want to do it. Because it's not always like, I don't think I could do it. It's like, I don't want to go into a toxic institution where nobody's going to be welcoming to me. When we interviewed now my minority leader Munson, right? She's now the minority leader. When we interviewed her for this project, she talked about how lonely it can be. As at that point, the sole Asian American woman in this legislature, and the lack of understanding among her peers. And in fact, even the aggression to say things like, oh, you keep talking about race and ethnicity, right? Like, and really pushing back against any opportunity to use that unique voice and perspective. So we know that those things do matter for influencing whether or not people make decisions to run. On the flip side, it's also inspirational, right? So there can be a mixed effect, because you look at that and you look at somebody like the minority leader and say like, well, maybe I too can do that, even though the numbers are small. Then when we get to further substantive, of course, conversations, it's about how does it change the conversation in these spaces? And we have a million examples. I'm sure everybody in this room has a million examples of how it matters when there are different voices at the table. But those voices it's not about your demographic checkbox. It's the idea that demographic identity or that intersection of identities creates distinct lived experiences and perspectives. And for those who really push back on me on this, I say, well, when a veteran runs for Congress, we hear all around like, oh, well, they're a veteran, they must know about national defense. And like, this is no shade to veterans. I agree, right? Like, this is like, there's an experience, there's a lived experience and perspective that they're going to bring that is unique. I push back and say, like, how different is that than like, if you are a Black woman in Oklahoma, you have a distinct experience. We know across all measures of education, access to resources, engagement with police, whatever it may be. We know that those experiences are different. Those two matter in policymaking because all of those issues are also being legislated. So a long answer to your question, but I think like those are how we have to be thinking about and talking about representation and its importance in the political sphere.
Yeah, and I think Monica asked a really good question in the chat around, are there any thoughts about quotas for women, especially in the legislative bodies? There must be some examples in a few Latin American countries where quotas have helped women progress through their legislative and representative process? Is it a strategy that maybe we should look at or consider? Even if it's not something we can formally put into place, maybe it's something that we aspire to.
Yeah, I mean, there are always these questions, and there's a organization called Represent Women that is really focused on structural solutions, right? Like, how can we change rules and processes in order to increase women's representation? And so they will raise this at times. I will admit that I am often a kind of not critic, but I am dubious that that is possible in our system, just because it's a constitutional change. So as you all know, like to make a change like that, to move from what would be, so quotas almost, no, universally really occur in places that are not candidate centered. So they're proportional systems of representation. And I just find I couldn't imagine our current elected leaders allowing any move to not a candidate centered system. But the ways around that then are, do you create, so in other countries, they've created party quotas. Again, that doesn't work here because the party doesn't choose the nominees. We as voters choose the nominees. So the one place that we have done it, or some states, I think it's only like 2 now, but that have done it, are create some level of quotas in appointees. And then we have tried to do that informally. When like a governor's elected, you'll see these efforts. They're often called women's appointments projects. I don't know if they've occurred in the states that you all are from, but where organizations have come together. In fact, it would be great for this group because it's like, and they give what Mitt Romney got in trouble for, the binders versus full of women. That's actually not a bad thing. I like defend Mitt Romney on this one because that's what the Women's Appointments Project would do. It would say, here are all these qualified women. We are asking you to commit to choosing 50% women in these appointed positions. So we've seen some minor success of that level of quota at that level of political power, but I think electorally it's hard. And then the last thing I'll say on that is it is the how effective it's been across the world. There's a lot of studies on that. I think mixed questions. It depends on the type of quotas, because sometimes what's happening is certainly like placeholder positions, right? So the critique of it is, oh, they're choosing these women who just will vote in line with. We see that in our own system, even that doesn't have quotas, like folks who are critical. And I want to be careful not to like buy into that critique, but I think sometimes in some countries where there's strong power of a central person or party, that often happens. So then this gets to the question of, how do you ensure that women retain their independence and power if you're in a system where it's more appointed than it is selected by the general body? But it's a great question. And I think we can think about other ways to pressure parties and also change voter thinking a little bit about the importance of representation in ways that could lead to, it's not quotas, but it could lead to more emphasis on parity and representation.
I definitely appreciate what you were saying around the kind of party structure and some of the challenges or opportunities around parties in the United States. And I think with younger generations in particular, the party structure is really becoming this very cumbersome. I used to be part of the younger generation. I'm not anymore, but that generation in general, really finds the party structure really challenging and has created sort of a disincentive for their engagement, I think, in particular for this upcoming election. And I think we sort of all saw maybe the outcome of party influencing on women's engagement in politics in the response from Senator Katie Britt. I saw Erica put that in the chat. She's the youngest Republican woman in the Senate. We're certainly happy to have her representation there. But I wonder, does she really represent a common experience among women, number one? And then, how she ended up in that role, if you look back around that seat and how she got there, what role do you think the party played in her being there and influencing and facilitating or potentially hindering women's careers particularly from a national standpoint? I think there's some challenges there, even when you look back around, Hillary Clinton's work coming into the presidential election, the last, couple of rounds. So just curious if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of directions to go in, on Katie Britt in particular. Look, I think we have to be able to hold a couple of things at one time, which is to say, like, I'm going to celebrate the fact that we have a young, Republican woman in the Senate, and that is a milestone. Again, does she have a distinct lived experience? She absolutely does. Does she have the full power to bring that forth in the current Senate? Maybe not, but that's true of Democratic women as well, right? Like that's not so much like a being restrained by the Republican Party, it's being a young new member. I think in the case of giving the response, not to go too far down that road, but you rarely win in that position, right? Most, I think if you're a political practitioner, you don't really necessarily want your member or your boss to be in that role because it doesn't end too well for most anybody. And I think what you saw in her case was, again, this reaction of like, she was highly controlled, it was highly produced, it was inconsistent with what we've seen before. And so I don't think there's any denying that there was influence beyond her own in how she gave that response. What I do think it showed is, and for any of you who haven't seen it yet, Rebecca Traister has a cover story out in New York Magazine that came out like 2 days ago about the challenges for Republican women in navigating gender and candidate representation in this moment, particularly in a Trump Republican Party. I've been writing about this for like a decade, so I was so glad that she wrote this, and of course she did it way better than me. And she comes from a partisan perspective, so like acknowledge that she's a Democrat and a progressive, so she's highly critical. But I think her points, if you kind of step back from that, are very real, which is that Republican women are confronting an electorate that has particularly staunch views around gender. So questions like society is becoming too soft and feminine, much higher numbers of Trump supporters, even of Republicans. So I want to distinguish, there's, difference there. Believe that men are being punished just for being men, believe in more traditional roles and representations for women, such as the fact that she's sitting in a kitchen in that response, and have firmer beliefs of what we would call in the literature hostile sexism. This is things like feminism has gone too far, women are asking for special favors, that kind of belief. That's true among men and women on the more conservative side of the aisle. So you're seeing these women in highly powerful positions try to cater to an electorate that doesn't necessarily align with the belief that women should be in those positions. And then also a presidential candidate nominee who's the head of the party, who's highly masculinized, right? So engages in this very masculine, I'm the tough guy, I'm the manliest man. So then masculinity becomes this standard that's so important. So what she writes about is, it's like these women trying to do all things. I have to be super masculine, so let me get the gun out, let me do the hunting and all of that. But I also have to be really feminine and aligned with those expectations. And what we saw with Katie Britt, I think, was more on that side of the aisle. But then you saw the and they're coming for you, that really severe language. So I feel a sort of sympathy for that, because that is the intersection of gender and party that's creating a difficulty for women on that side of the aisle, especially. It happens for Democratic women, but the gender dynamics of the Democratic Party have evolved in ways that I think have made it a little less challenging to circle those squares, or however we want to talk about it.
Well, I think it's interesting when because I watched the response live, and I agree, anyone in the role of doing the response is already losing in some ways, just from a political point of view. One, it's really late, especially if you're on the East Coast. And so it's challenging to have the right energy and to bring that there. But I was really reflecting and juxtaposing her response to Sarah Huckabee Sanders' response, because Sarah was really part of the political machine too, and came home to Arkansas and and played that role very differently, in her own response. And so I think it's even interesting how we treat women in particular roles, you know, uh, in different ways across parties. I'm just going to put this here, and we can leave it later if we want. But even the engagement between Representative Taylor Greene and Crockett recently, that kind of became this meme. While it was an interesting and and it made me giggle a little bit, I also felt a little bit sad that it happened between two women, in a very public space. It just really, I thought it really engendered a lot of stereotypes, right? And it calls on a narrative that sometimes men use when women are in executive roles that, not that men never argue, because I think we can pull up lots and lots of congressional testimony where they argue among themselves, but it felt really targeted in the way that it played, and the media was really interesting. So I think that also can be really discouraging for women who might be interested in doing this, but really just don't want to engage in that kind of behavior generally, right? But you're going to be in situations where you have to tackle that and really reflect on your own behavior. Because I'm not sure I would have behaved any different in that situation. So we would all like to, but it's a very public situation.
If I could just real quick speak to that, because I think what it reflected to for me, and I'm gonna get a little academic here, but there is so much of this, we talk about it as gender power, like a balance of gender power. So how much do we kind of value traditional femininity, value traditional masculinity, obviously recognizing these are all stereotypes, they're all socially constructed. We know this, okay? But that's the balance, right? And so women historically have suffered because in these institutions, there's been this emphasis on masculine traits, expectations. I mean, when Donald Trump says you don't have the presidential look, it's pretty obvious what he means, right? Like, you don't look like the person who's been here before. That's the overt way. But there are lots of less overt ways we criticize women and say they don't fit the masculine standard. So then we push women to behave in masculine ways and prove their masculine credentials. What bothered me about that moment, to your point, is that both of the women were playing into those gendered standards in ways that reinforced them, instead of what I really hope we would do, right? Which is disrupt them. That disrupt that balance, that your value is somehow based on your femininity or your values based on your masculinity. Easy for me to say from, an outside place, but I think that we see political practitioners, this goes back to Britt and how all these women also are told to behave. Political practitioners are like, we need to win the next, not even election, the next political moment. And again, no shade to practitioners. I get that. That's how you win. But at the same point, there's a longer term impact of that behavior, which is changing our minds as voters and observers about what we expect and what we value in these folks. And so when I did an interview with a consultant, this was about 10 years ago, and we were talking through some of this, and he was like, well, I'm not a social change agent. Like, that's not my job, right? Like, I'm here to win. And I was like, I get that, right? But how do we try to think about some of the longer term impact of the work that folks in the political sphere do when they're crafting kind of candidate presentation strategy and messaging?
So I think that brings up a really good question around when we're thinking about how we're going to vote and engage in the upcoming election. I think I was really reflecting on interview that you did with 538 around the soccer mom mentality in the early 90s and how everyone was like in this monolith of voting. How are campaigns approaching women in 2024 and as we head into the election? I think we all know that the post-Roe era is really a big narrative, but are there any other narratives, or do you think Roe is going to be as big as others are kind of portraying it to be?
It's a really good question. I think we don't have enough information yet, but I do think this question about Roe is important. I think the media already is like, that's the one thing. That's the one thing women are going to vote for. And I don't want to discount the impact. We saw the impacts of the fall of Roe in specific states particularly states that had abortion on the ballot, right? So states that had abortion ballot initiatives, absolutely, if you look at the impact, particularly for Democratic women, so increase in registration, increase in turnout, things like that. There was a notable impact, I think. I say I think because that was the immediate, kind of, we got the data we got immediately. I think it still needs to be kind of pushed through the more rigorous kind of peer-reviewed analysis. But I think it's fair to say. Going into this election, I was just, because I saw, we talked about a little bit what we would talk about. So I was looking at the Marist NPR poll that came out yesterday. So folks have probably heard about it because it got a good amount of attention. And this is just they cover a lot of things, including the horse race. But one of the things they ask is, what is the most important issue to your vote, your presidential vote? And they have some good crosstabs. So you can look at it by party and gender. So just to give you a sense of it, 39% of Democratic women said preserving democracy was the top issue influencing their vote. So that was the plurality. 14% said abortion. 5% of Democratic men said abortion, 6% for Republican women, 2% for Republican men. When it comes to independent women, obviously we're attentive, and practitioners are going to be attentive to independent women. 12% say abortion, but again, for that group, the plurality, 33% said preserving democracy. So I think that we have to be clear-eyed that, yes, abortion is a mobilizing issue. It has been on the right in this cycle because the threat is to those who are looking for preservation of reproductive rights. The threat will motivate engagement. And that is why you see Biden doing ads on abortion and targeting them. For those of you who get, targeted ads on your social media, you're probably getting those ads based on your demographics. But I don't necessarily think, I think we would miss out on the bigger story by not paying attention to these other issues that are really motivating women. And the last piece there I'd say is I'd be paying much more attention, and the media typically, and campaigns as well, have done a terrible job of this over time, paying attention to women of color broadly, but specifically Latinas and Black women voters. Here, and as well as young women voters. Here, those intersections in those particular groups, we need to know enthusiasm, turnout, and particularly for Latinas, direction of support in order to know what's going to happen in November, especially in the presidential level, but also in states where there are changing demographics. And I say that particularly for Latinas as well as Asian women. For Black women, you're really talking about, there's not going to be that much movement, despite what some of the arguments are in the news right now. There's not going to be that much movement in the percentage, how the percentage of Black women, 90 plus, who are going to vote for Joe Biden. However, if that turnout is down, those are the women who have been the most critical part of the Democratic coalition. And so if that turnout and enthusiasm, disillusionment is high, and you're speaking only to one issue and not the issues that matter to those groups of voters, which are going to be different, then I think that's something for the Democrats and the Republicans to be concerned about.
One thing that I was thinking about as you were talking was, yes, Black women in the last presidential election, but I think even I follow Arizona politics really closely because of the work that I do. And women, particularly Native women, were very important in that election for the senatorial race. And I think they're currently being targeted from what I can see on the outside, not living there, for the upcoming kind of close race that could change, the dynamic of women in the Senate. And so I think it would be, it's still a good time to be a female voter. It's really important to pay attention and to make decisions. And I agree with you. I think Oklahoma really thought that we would have a more a stronger Democratic turnout, or our elections would look different when medical marijuana was on the ballot a couple of years ago. And I don't know if coattails thing always works out. That's kind of where we are. And so I hope we're not over relying on that, especially as women who often manage the finances in the home, are really clear about the economy too. And I know this group, is really involved in the economy and investment and sort of looking after our own families. looking forward to November, now that we're through the primaries here, there might be a couple of elections. I know locally we'll have at least one more here in Oklahoma. Are there any predictions for November? Anything that we should be doing as women, working in our communities, preparing for the outcome of 2024 in any way? Anything you're thinking about?
Yeah, so I'll start with kind of predictions, which, with all the necessary caveats, political scientists are really bad at predicting things. But for women office holders, as I mentioned before, I don't expect that we're going to see big gains. And I think we need to be ready for that, especially in communities that are advocating for that increase in representation. We have to be able to speak to why and what to do differently to ensure that we don't have that stasis in every election. Again, we're still underrepresented at every level. And so while I don't think stasis is a sign of like impending doom, it's a problem. It's a problem because we're too far from parity and too far from fair representation. So at this point in the cycle, from what we know from primaries, there are more gains. It looks like we'll see more gains for Democrats than Republican women at the congressional level at the least. I'll get into a little more specificity. So for context, women are 27% of all House candidates already filed. There's only 4 states left to file. So that number probably won't change much. That's really consistent with the last 3 cycles in terms of the percentage. With 61% of House nominations decided, so we have more of a ways to go there. Women are 29% of House nominees. That's down from the last 2 cycles. So kind of making it through to the next cycle. Not hugely, but it is down. In raw numbers, it looks like the numbers of women candidates at the federal level will fall short of previous highs. It won't be a record year. That's true for men as well, because we did look at that. We were like, is it just that fewer people overall are running? I think that's part of the story. But we are seeing a slightly higher drop for women and a highest drop for Republican women, at least writ large. It's hard with Republican women because we're starting from such a lower number. So I want to be like all the necessary caveats that like a larger percentage drop is fewer in numbers. But I do think it's important, like keep our eyes on that and why it's happening. So then I'm going to focus on the U.S. House. At the Senate level, we almost know what's going to happen. I mean, there are these unpredictable kind of races, but if things pan out, I think the most we can do is increase by 1 for women in the Senate. I think I have that right. It's like 1 or 2. For the House, this is a little more complicated math, but we have to look at the women who are leaving. 13 women are leaving. That gives us a 13 member deficit to start with. 8 women as of right now are incumbents are in vulnerable seats. So that's another 8 deficit we could have. Then we have to look at potential pickups. So we look at non-incumbents. Right now, there are 8 women favored, like 8 women who look like they're going to win. So say they fill 8 of those 13 original slots. There are 7 more women in competitive, non-incumbent women in competitive contests. Any of that, as of today, gets us to almost like equal, right? It doesn't get us to higher. Now, we've got 40% of House nominations left to make. So we have other opportunities that will include vulnerable incumbents, but that will also include some potential pickups. But this is why I'm saying, like, I think we're at a year where we're not going to see huge net gains in women's representation at the congressional level. It's hard for us to do this at the state legislative level because we can tell you how many nominees there are. We're pretty sure, again, that that's not going to be a record. The one distinguishing characteristic at the state level, we put out a blog on this like 2 weeks ago, that I think is notable, is the only group at the intersection of gender and party. The only group that's seeing an increase just in overall state legislative candidacies are Democratic women. So something's going on. Many people say to me immediately, it's abortion. I don't know that it's abortion because for all the reasons I just talked about, I don't think that's the only issue motivating women. However, I think that is probably among the things because we know this is happening in state legislatures. And so there may be both more active recruitment as well as motivation among some women running at those state legislative levels. But the proof's kind of in the pudding. Do they get through to the nominee stage? So we're paying attention to that. And then just in terms of prediction for the presidency, I will just say the disillusionment in the electorate benefits Donald Trump.
I want to, there was a good question from Monica, but I'm going to take liberty here and ask really quick around if there is a generational difference in how in trends for women, because I know we're talking a lot about race and kind of party, but and you mentioned a little bit about young women, but I wasn't sure if there was anything more there that we wanted to tease out as a group.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we are seeing, so in terms of office holding, what a positive trend, not, we don't have all the data in 24 already about the age of everybody, right? But even you can see it anecdotally, and then you can see it kind of by concrete data in the last 3 cycles, younger women being more willing and able to run and be successful. They're also the ones who are pushing boundaries on how women run and present themselves. My favorite example of this is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in her first ad, which, by the way, she never had to air because it went viral, so she never had to pay for it. The first line is, "Women like me aren't supposed to run for office." And what she's doing in that ad, I would argue, is she's saying the onus is on all of you to think differently about who's supposed to run and what a member of Congress is supposed to look like. Instead of typically in campaigns when we put the onus on the candidate to adapt to the expectations, right? To make her look like a member of Congress or a candidate in a way that would be more aligned. So I think women, younger women in particular, are pushing boundaries. I think we're seeing them run. You talked about Katie Britt. I'm totally having a moment, but the Kat Cammack in Florida, like this. So there are women on both sides of the aisle that are younger women who are coming into these spaces. I think we'll see more of that this cycle. There are a couple women, I can kind of see their faces on the pickups that we might get that are younger. So we'll see some of that generational change. But on the flip side, that disillusionment is both preventing some of the younger, more engaged women to decide to run. And then also in the project that we did, this Rethinking Power project, when we were talking to a lot of women office holders and even those working in these fields, when they get into office, especially younger and more progressive women, or on the Republican side, arguably more moderate women, their base is not sticking with them once they're in. And so the ability to stay is a real problem. So on the progressive side, you see it most commonly, it's like an activist who, thankful to them for like being willing to run, they go into an institution where they can't make the kind of quick change that their constituencies want. And then they're called traitors or sellouts or whatever. And I think that's a real problem because we're going to lose women. And particularly young and often more progressive women who were willing to take it on, but then, either lost or just decided not to run again.
I think there was even risk of that, like with AOC early in her term, right? Like there was really a push from leadership in the House for her to assimilate, for lack of a better word, into operations of the House, and she had support, among her peers, and there was a group that that became very stylized. But I definitely agree.
Well, I think
and there's some Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to change the subject. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it gets to your question about what we can all do on the positive side, which is like you can't just elect a woman and then be like, great, she's in. Like, folks have to be supportive when the party leadership pushes against them, when other voters come out to attack them, when they're like, you have to be able to stick with those women. And sticking with those women is not only voting, it's like getting other people in that, explaining to other people why they're doing what they're doing. Because I've been doing that here. Like we have a city council member who got elected, our first LGBT lesbian woman. And my folks are like, oh, she's not doing enough. And I'm like, but here's what she's doing in the constraints of what she can do. And I need you to stick with her, right? We can give money. Like some of us don't love that that's the way the political system works, but money matters. It's not only because it matters for the campaign, it's also an indicator of support. So people use that as a way to say like, oh, well, she has money. I guess I could vote for her because she's going to win. So we have power to do those things, whatever is most comfortable for you. But like, there are ways to get involved that go beyond the vote. I think that was one of the questions, and I would say also for those, I think there was some discussion of the supermajority and the challenge of that. I will say what I learned, you all will know better, but what I learned in doing a lot of interviews in Oklahoma was like, there are a lot of local levels and different areas in the state where you can have an influence that maybe aren't the state legislature, but can make policy. And there's a lot of foundational work going on as well in Oklahoma that's pushing policy outside of governmental structures. So I think there are still these places to exercise what I would still call political power and influence. It just may not be in the style or target of place that you think.
No, that's a really great point. And I appreciate you picking up, because that's kind of where I was going, was like, what do we do? Because I think everyone, post primary, there's a little fatigue always after a day of voting, and there was a lot of door knocking in my neighborhood. I don't know about everywhere else, but there's just a little bit of fatigue. So, we can get a day of rest maybe, but how do we get recharged, and what are some tips kind of moving into the next cycle?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things I mentioned is, obviously supporting candidates financially, volunteering, word of mouth, all the things you're talking about. And we talked about making the case to other people about why it's important that they participate, like making it real, right? You all probably have more stories about like things you've worked on, whether you're an advocate, whether you're in business, in all different areas of like how that was affected by government. I think making that real to people who feel like they just want to throw in the towel can make a difference. Or the folks who are like, I'm not voting because the presidential is I just really don't like these old white guys. Cool, like fine, but there's a lot of other things you need to vote for. I would still argue you need to vote for them too, but like kind of really, there's a little bit of education that those of us who maybe are more engaged could do. Doesn't always work, but it's worth it, I think. I would also say like we have a responsibility not to rely on our own echo chambers. If you only follow your TikTok, if you only follow your Instagram feed, like some of you are going to think like this party's winning and it's a shoo-in. Some of you are going to think this party's going to win or you think the world's going to end tomorrow. That's, I feel like, what my feed is. But like I have to actively myself be like, okay, I'm not looking at that, right? Like I have to look at more tangible, if you will, like kind of measures of how things are looking. I worry about polls. Like you have to filter the information that we're all taking in to keep us engaged. And sometimes it also means you have to, as you mentioned, take a break. And so I've been reading a lot of books that have nothing to do with politics, so that I can refuel to kind of be engaged when I need to be engaged. So I think that's a blanket, thing that I'm sure we've all tried to think about. What are the ways that we can refuel and pull back so that we can be energized, especially as we go into November, to participate in whatever way we think we can.
If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend and don't forget to leave us a review. And if you're ready to take your career to the next level, apply to join our community of professional women, all eager to help you get there and stay there. Go to www.vesther.co and apply today.